Arthur Vance straightened his bow tie one final time before entering the Palais Liechtenstein's grand ballroom. The November rain had been relentless all day in Vienna, but inside, the crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow that made the weather irrelevant. 27 years in the Foreign Service had taught him that these gatherings were theaters where every gesture mattered, every conversation a potential shift in the delicate balance of international relations. The reception, celebrating the new trade agreements between the European Union and the United States, was exactly the kind of event where careers were made or quietly destroyed over champagne and canapés. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, acknowledging the German ambassador with a slight nod, exchanging pleasantries with the French cultural attaché about her daughter's acceptance to Columbia University. His movements were calculated, each step deliberate, as he navigated toward the Hungarian delegation. The briefing folder he'd reviewed that morning had emphasized the importance of securing their support for the upcoming NATO expansion talks. Arthur's mind catalogued faces, stored away snippets of conversation for later analysis, all while maintaining the pleasant half-smile that had become his default expression at such events. The marble floors reflected the movement of perhaps 200 guests, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum that mixed with the string quartet positioned near the grand staircase. Arthur accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, though he had no intention of drinking it. Props were important in this theatre. He was about to approach Ambassador Kovacs when the quartet concluded their piece, and the evening's entertainment was announced. A young singer would perform a selection of European classics, the kind of cultural gesture meant to celebrate the continent's shared heritage, while the Americans smiled and pretended to appreciate the nuances. She couldn't have been more than 25, Arthur observed as she took her position near the piano. Dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, a simple black evening dress that suggested she was a professional, but not yet established enough to afford anything more elaborate. The pianist, an elderly man with kind eyes, whispered something to her, and she nodded, taking a breath that Arthur could see lift her shoulders even from across the room. The crowd quieted out of politeness rather than anticipation. Most continued their conversations in hushed tones, using the performance as sophisticated background music for their negotiations and gossip. The first notes from the piano drifted across the ballroom, and then she began to sing. Not French, as Arthur had expected, not Italian or German, but Russian. The words flowed from her lips like water over stones, an old lullaby about winter's embrace and a love that waited beneath the snow. Arthur's champagne glass slipped from his fingers. The crystal shattered against the marble with a sound that should have been thunderous, but seemed distant, muffled, as if happening in another room, another life. He was vaguely aware of concerned murmurs around him, of a server rushing forward with a cloth, but none of it registered. The voice continued, each note precise and haunting, carrying a weight of sorrow that seemed impossible for someone so young. But Arthur wasn't seeing the singer anymore. He was seeing another face, another time, when that same melody had been whispered against his neck in a cold Moscow apartment, the radiator clanking its irregular rhythm while snow piled against windows that barely kept out the Soviet winter. He could smell the black tea they'd shared, too weak because they'd used the leaves twice already, could feel the weight of Anya's head on his shoulder as she hummed that lullaby her grandmother had taught her, the one she said would always bring loved ones home. His legs wouldn't move. His trained diplomatic composure, decades in the making, crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to air. Someone was speaking to him, the British consul perhaps, but the words were meaningless sounds. All he could hear was that voice, that song, pulling him backward through time with the force of a riptide. The singer's eyes were closed as she sang, lost in the emotion of the piece, unaware that across the room she was unraveling a man who had spent his entire career learning how to feel nothing. The rain outside had turned to sleet, tapping against the tall windows like urgent fingers, like the coded messages he used to leave for Anya in the dead drops around Moscow. before everything went wrong, before the KGB discovered their relationship, before he was given 48 hours to leave the country, and she simply disappeared into the machinery of the state. He'd looked for her through every channel, official and otherwise, for 5 years before accepting what everyone told him, that she was gone, that people who disappeared into Lubyanka rarely emerged, and when they did, they were no longer themselves. But that song, her grandmother's lullaby, how could this young woman know it unless she had learned it from someone who had learned it from Anya herself? Moscow, 1986. The city stretched grey and endless beneath a February sky that promised more snow before nightfall. Arthur stood at the window of his apartment in the foreigners' compound, watching the guards at the gate check papers with the kind of thorough attention that made even innocent people feel guilty. He'd been in Moscow for 8 months, officially serving as a cultural attaché at the American embassy, though everyone knew that half the cultural attachés in Moscow were something else entirely. The Cold War didn't allow for pure intentions, not even in art and literature. He'd met Anya at a state-approved gathering for international dialogue, one of those carefully choreographed events where selected Soviet citizens could interact with foreigners under the watchful eyes of handlers who pretended to be waiters and translators. She was there as an interpreter. Though her English was so flawless, he'd initially wondered if she might be an American playing a very deep game. It was only when she'd laughed at his careful joke about Dostoevsky that he'd heard it, the slight roll of her R's that betrayed her Russian heart. They'd talked about literature at first, the safe ground of dead authors and their universal themes. She'd surprised him by knowing not just the classics, but contemporary American writers too, though she was careful to frame her knowledge in politically acceptable terms. Their first real conversation had happened by accident, or what passed for accident, in a city where nothing was truly accidental. A sudden November snowstorm had trapped them both in the library of the All-Union State Library of Foreign Literature after an embassy-sponsored lecture. The metro had stopped running, the streets were impassable, and they'd found themselves alone in a reading room while they waited for the weather to clear. She'd removed her official interpreter's jacket, and suddenly she was just Anya, 28 years old, with eyes the color of winter sky, and a smile that appeared so rarely it felt like a gift when it did. She'd told him about her grandmother that night, about the village near Novgorod, where she'd grown up before the war, about the lullabies she sang to help children sleep through the sound of German bombs. The melody Anya hummed was haunting. Minor key transitions that seemed to carry all of Russian history in their notes. She'd taught it to Arthur later, in whispered lessons in his apartment when they thought the microphones might be sleeping, though they both knew microphones never really slept in Moscow. It became their song, their code, hummed in crowded metro stations when they couldn't acknowledge each other, sung softly in the rare moments they found true privacy. The relationship was impossible, and they both knew it. Arthur's position meant he was watched constantly, and Anya's work as an interpreter for foreign delegations made her equally scrutinized. But Moscow winter nights were long and cold, and human connection has a way of defying even the most oppressive surveillance. They developed elaborate routines to meet, using dead drops to leave messages, creating reasons to be in the same place at the same time that would seem coincidental to anyone reviewing the files later. Arthur learned to notice the small signals, like whether she wore her blue scarf or her grey one, whether her hair was pinned on the left or right. Each variation meant something different, such as safe to meet, being watched, or danger. The apartment where they finally felt safe enough to be themselves was a friend's place, someone who owed Anya a favor and asked no questions. It was there, with the radiator clanking and snow building up against windows that hadn't been sealed properly since before the revolution, that she'd told him about her father's death in the Gulag, about her mother's remarriage to a party official who'd protected them but never let them forget the price of that protection, about her dreams of seeing the world beyond the Soviet borders that felt more like prison walls with each passing year. Arthur had been foolish enough to think he could save her. He'd made inquiries about defection, careful ones, through channels he thought were secure. He'd imagined a life where she could see the New York he'd described to her, where they could walk freely down Broadway without checking for surveillance, where her brilliant mind could pursue the doctoral degree in literature she'd always wanted but been denied because of her father's political crimes. He'd been so careful, but not careful enough. Love makes even the best operatives sloppy, and Moscow in 1986 was an unforgiving place for sloppy people. The knock had come at 3 a.m. at his official apartment. 2 men in suits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it informed him that his presence in the Soviet Union was no longer welcome and that he had 48 hours to leave. They'd smiled when they said it. The kind of smile that made it clear they knew everything about Anya, about the apartment, about the inquiries he'd made. When he'd tried to contact her through their usual channels, there was only silence. The applause pulled Arthur back to the present, though his body remained frozen in place. The young singer bowed gracefully, accepting the polite appreciation of an audience that had no idea they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Arthur watched her leave the small stage, disappearing through a side door that likely led to a service corridor. His legs finally responded, carrying him forward through the crowd that parted unconsciously for him, perhaps sensing the intensity radiating from his frame. The Hungarian ambassador called his name, but Arthur didn't turn. 27 years of diplomatic protocol evaporated as he pushed through the door the singer had used. The corridor was narrow and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the ballroom's opulence. He could hear her footsteps ahead, the click of heels on concrete floors. She was moving toward what must be a performer's green room, and Arthur followed, his mind racing through possibilities that each seemed more impossible than the last. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 3 decades of international intelligence work, screamed that this was coincidence, that Russian lullabies weren't unique to one grandmother in Novgorod, that he was chasing ghosts because he'd never properly grieved what he'd lost. He found her collecting her coat from a small room where the string quartet was packing their instruments. Up close, she looked even younger, and Arthur felt his certainty waver. Her features were wrong, weren't they? The cheekbones too sharp, the nose slightly different, but then she turned and he saw her eyes, not blue like Anya's but green, yet with the same depth, the same way of seeming to see through surface things to what lay beneath. She noticed him standing in the doorway and smiled politely, the professional smile of a performer acknowledging an admirer. The words stuck in his throat at first, decades of training warring with desperate need. Finally, he managed to speak in Russian, his accent still passable after all these years. He complimented her performance, told her the lullaby was beautiful, that he hadn't heard it in many years. Her expression shifted, surprise flickering across her features. She responded in accented English, saying her mother had taught it to her, that it was very old, from her grandmother's village. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs as he asked as casually as he could manage what village that might be. When she said Novgorod, the world tilted slightly. He gripped the doorframe and she stepped forward, concern replacing her professional demeanor. Was he all right, she asked. Should she call someone? Arthur shook his head, forced himself to breathe normally. He introduced himself, using only his first name, saying he was with the American delegation. She told him her name was Katya Petrova, that she was a graduate student at the Vienna Conservatory, that singing at events like this helped pay for her studies. The conversation felt surreal, like speaking through glass, every word carefully chosen while larger questions pressed against his consciousness. He asked about her mother, framing it as polite interest in her musical heritage. Katya's expression grew complicated, a mixture of pride and something else. Perhaps sadness or old anger. Her mother had been a translator in Moscow, she said, but had left Russia in 1989 when everything was changing. She'd married an Austrian businessman, a man who'd helped them leave when the borders finally opened. They'd built a new life in Vienna. Though her mother never forgot the old songs, the old stories, she'd insisted Katya learn them all, even when Katya wanted to focus on German Lieder or Italian arias. Arthur's mind calculated rapidly. The timeline fit. If Anya had survived, if she'd somehow endured whatever happened after his extraction, she could have escaped during the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse. She would have been 31 then, still young enough to start over, to marry, to have a daughter who would now be the age of the woman standing before him. He wanted to ask directly, to show Katya a photograph he still carried, despite promising himself he'd thrown them all away. But the habits of a lifetime held him back. Instead, he asked if Katya's mother ever spoke of the time before Vienna, of friends she might have had in Moscow. Katya's eyes narrowed slightly, the look of someone recognizing that a conversation has become something other than what it seemed. Her mother didn't speak much of Moscow, she said carefully, only that it had been a difficult time, that she'd lost people she cared about, that Vienna had given them a second chance they hadn't expected. She glanced at her watch, mentioned she had another engagement, began to gather her things with movements that suggested flight. Arthur knew he was losing her, that his questions had triggered some protective instinct inherited or learned from a mother who'd survived by being careful. Arthur pulled out his diplomatic credentials, not to intimidate, but to establish trust. He told Katya he needed just 5 more minutes, that what he had to say might be important to her mother. She hesitated, her hand on her coat, then slowly sat back down. The string quartet had left, and they were alone in the small room that smelled of rosy and old wood. Arthur chose his words carefully, speaking of a time when Moscow was a different world, when he'd known a translator named Anya, who sang the same lullaby, who'd spoken of her grandmother's village near Novgorod, with the same mixture of love and loss he'd heard in Katya's voice. He watched recognition dawn in her eyes, followed quickly by wariness. Her mother had never mentioned any Americans from Moscow, she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. Arthur pulled out his wallet, extracted a photograph he'd carried for 37 years, edges soft from handling. It showed a young woman laughing in Gorky Park, snow in her dark hair, the Moscow State University building visible in the background. He'd taken it on one of the few afternoons they'd dared to be seen together in public, pretending to be part of a larger group of international students and interpreters. He handed it to Katya without a word. Her intake of breath was sharp, involuntary. She stared at the photograph, then at Arthur, then back at the image. This was her mother, she whispered, but so young, so different from the careful woman who'd raised her in Vienna. She'd never seen her mother laugh like that, with such complete abandon. There were no photographs from Moscow in their apartment. Her mother had said they'd all been lost, that it was better to look forward than back. Katya's hands trembled slightly as she held the picture, and Arthur saw her mother in that gesture too, the way Anya's hands had trembled when she'd told him about her father. Arthur told her the story then, the truth he'd never told anyone, not his handlers at the CIA, not his wife during his brief marriage that had ended because she'd known he was haunted by someone else, not the therapist the State Department had insisted he see after particularly difficult postings. He told her about the love that had bloomed despite the impossibility, about the song that had become their secret language, about the night the KGB had come and the 48 hours that had destroyed everything. He told her how he'd searched, how he'd used every connection and favor to find out what had happened to Anya, how every lead had ended in silence or misdirection. Katya listened without interrupting, though tears had begun to trace paths down her cheeks. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak. Her mother had never told her the whole story, but she'd pieced together fragments over the years. She knew her mother had been interrogated after an American diplomat had been expelled, that she'd spent 2 years in internal exile in a city whose name she was never told, that she'd been allowed to return to Moscow only after signing documents she never spoke about. She knew her mother had tried to contact someone in the West for years, but the letters were always returned or simply disappeared. Her mother had married Hans, the Austrian businessman, not for love, but for escape, though she'd grown to care for him over the years before his death from cancer 5 years ago. She'd built a successful translation business in Vienna, had raised Katya to be proud but careful, to understand that freedom was precious precisely because it could be lost. She'd insisted Katya learn the old songs because she said they were the only things that couldn't be taken away, the only possessions that required no papers, no permission to carry across borders. Arthur asked the question he'd been afraid to ask since hearing the lullaby. Was Anya still in Vienna? Was she well? Would she want to know he'd never forgotten, never stopped loving her? Katya stood, paced to the small window that looked out onto a narrow alley where the rain had finally stopped. Her mother was alive, she said, but she'd become someone else. Anna Richter, widow, businesswoman, Austrian citizen. She rarely spoke Russian anymore except when singing the old songs. She'd built walls around her heart that even Katya could rarely penetrate. But perhaps, Katya said, turning back to face him, perhaps it was time for those walls to come down. Her mother was at their apartment tonight, probably reading or listening to the radio, as she always did when Katya performed. She'd be surprised by an unexpected visitor, but maybe surprise was what she needed. Katya wrote down an address in Vienna's 2nd district, handed it to Arthur with the photograph. She would call ahead, she said, prepare her mother for a ghost from the past, though she wasn't sure any preparation would be adequate. Arthur stood outside the apartment building an hour later, looking up at lit windows on the 3rd floor. The rain had washed the city clean, and the air smelled of wet stone and possibility. He thought of all the years between then and now, all the choices that had led to this moment. Then he pressed the buzzer, heard a voice he would have recognized anywhere say his name, like a question and an answer all at once. The door clicked open, and Arthur Vance climbed the stairs toward whatever remained of a love that had survived the Cold War, even if the lovers themselves had barely survived each other's absence.